Here's a few quotes from the lawyer that I mentioned, the semi-famous lawyer, Clarence Darrow. Apparently, by the way, he was like one of those like archetypal foghorn leghorn, like, I'm just a simple country lawyer. So he has a whole screed on eugenics, and it's called, interestingly enough, Cult of Eugenics.
Oh, I think we have our answer, friends.
He wrote this in 1925.
Uh-oh.
No, that's not uh-oh. That's good. I
just mean uh-oh for all the guys who were like still doing eugenics.
Oh, yeah. That's not good for like the Davenports who were like working with Nazis in the 30s.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that they probably should have figured out this stuff before
they weren't not being told.
Yeah.
Quote, even if human breeding could be so controlled... Sorry, I won't do that. Quote, even if human breeding could be so controlled as to produce a race such as the eugenicists desire, we might still lose much that is worthwhile. It is hardly possible to breed certain qualities in without breeding others out. I, for one, am alarmed at the conceit and sureness of the advocates of this new dream. I shudder at their ruthlessness and meddling with life. I resent their egotistic and stern righteousness. I shrink from their judgment of their fellows. Everyone who passes judgment necessarily assumes that he is right. It seems to me that man can bring comfort and happiness out of life only by tolerance, kindness, and sympathy, all of which seem to find no place in the eugenicist creed. The whole program means the absolute violation of what men instinctively feel to be inherent rights. End quote. All right, you ready to just get into this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? It's hot in here.
Are you recording?
Yeah. I'm recording and I'm sweating. Kayla, are you excited to be here on Culture Just... This is Culture Just Weird. Are you excited to be on the show?
No.
I'm glad to have you on the show, even though I always have you on the show and you have me.
I always have you on the show. I'm always on the show. I'm always excited to be here. I'm a little apprehensive about today's topic, however.
Why would you be No, this is going to be a learning experience for everyone involved. I'm Chris. I am a game designer and data scientist.
I'm Kayla. I'm a TV writer. And
as mentioned, this is Cult or Just Weird. I don't think we have any business, do we?
I don't.
Actually, even if we did have, like, we need to get going. Like, one of the things about this topic is it's so big, and we've been trying to do short episodes this season, and I've been really struggling with that. So my compromise to myself is I'm going to break this up into 2 episodes because there's a logical break. I want to do some of our usual asking each other questions. Actually, I ask you questions. The host asks the listener, or you're the reactor? What are you? Listening?
Pretty reactive.
Yeah. Usually one of us asks the other one a question. I'm going to start the same way today. I want to play a game called Guess the Wikipedia Article.
I don't want to do this. Oh, no, I'm scared. Okay, let's do it. Let's go. I'm excited.
The idea of a dystopian society based on dysgenics can be traced back to the work of eugenicist Sir Francis Galton. H.G. Wells's 1895 novel, The Time Machine, postulates a society of humans which has devolved due to lack of challenges.
Oh, I forgot that was a eugenicist book.
While the epsilon-minus semi-morons of Aldous Huxley's 1932 novel Brave New World have been intentionally bred to provide a low-grade workforce. Perhaps the best parallel, and this is actually talking about the parallel to so it's the title of the article. So perhaps the best parallel is provided by the 1951 short story The Marching Morons by Cyril M. Kornbluth. By the way, I read a summary of The Marching Morons, and it's a hell of a thing. It's not good.
Should we, it's a little too late, but I guess maybe just a nice little content warning for our listeners that we're going to be using some not so nice language.
There's some language. It's not so nice language, and one of the things that we're going to talk about is that this is language that's actually fairly normalized, but didn't really start out that way. So there's like, I don't know. It's got a language that has a complicated history, like most language. Anyway,
Okay, so
Which
what am I supposed to
Wikipedia
do?
article do you think that whole description was from? Like, what's the parallel to the marching morons that they were just talking about?
I am a moron, so I
Diagnosed moron.
I don't have any idea what the parallel is, because I was going to be like, oh, this is pulled from the Eugenics Wikipedia, but
Close.
the Eugenics parallel, I don't know.
Close. That's from the background section of the Wikipedia article on Idiocracy.
Of course it is. Are we going to talk about that movie?
Just now. Like, that's literally the only reason I did this bit, is to talk about Idiocracy, because it doesn't really fit in anywhere else. But I definitely want to bitch about it, because it is like such a eugenics movie.
Oh my God. It is the most eugenics movie.
And that paragraph really hammers that home. So the idea of a dystopian society based on dysgenics can be traced back to the work of eugenicist Sir Francis Galton, who we will talk about as he is the father of eugenics. But that's not a good thing to have your movie be about.
No, it's really not. It's really not. And
we're probably going to bleed listeners here, because people seem to love that movie.
People do love Idiocracy. And look, I love what's his face. I love that guy. Who's the guy that's in it? Luke Wilson.
Luke Wilson.
I love a good Luke Wilson.
Mike Judge.
You know, I am a gigantic Beavis and Butthead fan. Love Beavis and Butthead. I do not like Idiocracy. And I do not like Idiocracy because it is a eugenics movie. Like that.
It is. It's like, what if eugenics was also smug? Like, that's Idiocracy.
Politically smug too.
Right.
And it's I am resentful of the resurgence that it's had in meme culture.
It really has,
because we live in a society, because in America we have so much political strife, and one of our favorite things to do is go the other side is dumb. And what better way to do that than show Idiocracy, in which the idea is that everybody became dumb over hundreds and hundreds of years.
If you eat at Fuddruckers, you're dumb.
You're dumb. And I can't deny that when you have a movie like Idiocracy, where there's pro wrestling guys coming out at the political events, and then you have
Hulk Hogan was at the RNC recently,
and then you have that exact same thing happen in real life. I see the parallel. And also, this is a eugenics movie. This is a eugenics movie. Look at the Wikipedia. It's a eugenics movie. Are you going to explain what Idiocracy is?
I don't think I have time for that, because as stated at the top of the show, this is a really big topic, and we're trying to get it in 2 episodes, but it's a movie by Mike Judge. It's funny that it ties back into the first episode of the season 2, the first arc, is because Luke Wilson's character gets essentially cryogenically frozen.
Oh, he does?
Okay. It's like hibernation sleep or whatever the hell, but it's basically that. And so then he wakes up in the future where all of the dumb people have outbred the smart people, and everyone in America is dumb. And the conceit is also, hold on. Oh, no, you hold on. Luke Wilson is in today's whatever, where he's from now, he's a very average or below average intelligence person, but in the world of Idiocracy that he wakes up in, he's the smartest one.
Right.
But it's just it's played for laughs, of course.
It's not just that they're dumb, Christopher. They're dumb and fat.
Oh, right. Well,
they're dumb and they eat McDonald's.
To guys like Mike Judge, that's
the same thing.
That is the same thing. Yeah. One of the movie posters for Idiocracy is The Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci, except it's a fat guy with a belly.
Holding a soda and wearing flip-flops.
So fucking smug. Oh my God. Okay. Really though, this is not about Idiocracy. This is... You
know where you can talk about Idiocracy? Come to our Discord, linked in the show notes. I will gladly bitch about Idiocracy with you on the internet.
That's a good idea. And in fact, we forgot to call to action that too. Yeah. Go to our show notes. That's where the Discord link is. And you can argue against us too. I'm sure there's probably a lot of people out there that love Idiocracy, and tell us why we're wrong on Discord. But that was just a little fun debate to kick off our 2-episode arc about eugenics. Okay, I actually have another question for you as well. This is more of a normal cult or just weird question, where I'm just going to ask you something that will just be interesting to have in the back recesses of our minds while we talk about this topic of eugenics. So we will get into the details of what eugenics is. But suffice it to say, eugenics is about breeding human beings for certain qualities. I need that as a precursor to this question, because what I want to ask you is, so eugenics is typically associated with like stuff we don't like.
Right.
It's like typically like very racist, and we'll get to all this stuff. But what I want to ask you is, how would you feel about it if instead of the main eugenicists of prior times and our time, instead of talking about wanting to breed, you know, for the master white race, or, you know, whatever the distasteful thing is that we find distasteful, how would you feel about it if instead of veering into that, instead they were talking about selecting for things like tolerance or love or pro-social stuff, like, yeah, kindness. Yeah. And what if it worked instead of just being bad science?
I think, and I hope that I would still have an issue with it, because I don't think the only issue, and I'm sure you'll tell me, I don't think the only issue with eugenics is that like the eugenicists were selecting for like the wrong things or the things that I don't like. I think it's more, yes, that's bad. And also the selective breeding of humans in this like way is really ethically dark and grim and sticky and murky.
Would it be harder to answer that if I said, like, if it was, instead of selecting for kindness, what if it was selecting against people that were going to join the KKK and do mass shootings?
Well, I don't believe that you can do that. I don't believe that you can do that.
But what if you could? What if we found a mass
that feels that I don't think that we're going to find that. And that does feel a little bit like we're getting into like arresting people for future crime to like a crazy degree.
Right.
And then this conversation is making me think of conversations we've had before about things like how we can do genetic testing in utero to see
that's what I was going to go to next.
To quote unquote catch if a fetus is going to be born with certain genetic abnormalities. And that gives the pregnant person the option then to potentially terminate the pregnancy or not.
How would you feel about that?
How would I feel about that, or do I feel about that?
I'm trying to decide whether, because we're definitely going to get in a little bit into birth control movement. But maybe I'll just ask you here. Like, there is a quote from Dr. Watson, not
Sherlock Holmes?
Not Sherlock Holmes Watson. This is Watson and Crick Watson, who both of those guys apparently had some like really weird things to say. Watson, I'll just say it. It came off the wrong way, apparently, with him. Is basically he said, like, if in theory there were a gene for homosexuality and we could discover it, would it be ethical for that mother to be able to terminate the pregnancy? And actually, the way he put it was he's in favor of that because he thinks any mother should have the freedom to terminate their own pregnancy for any reason. He got a lot of flack for that, understandably so.
Yeah.
But it does raise an interesting question of like, just exactly how pro-choice am I?
I know, because I think that what I want to say to that potential pregnant person is, if you would terminate a pregnancy over the thought of raising a gay child, then I don't think that you're ready to be a parent. And I think that that's a bigger conversation. But then am I a hypocrite if I don't have that same knee-jerk reaction to somebody who would terminate a pregnancy in which trisomy 18 or something that's incompatible with life, a disability that's incompatible with life, is present in the fetus? Shouldn't I be then saying to any parent, like, well, unless you're ready to care for a child that has a severe disability and will die, are you not ready to be a parent yet? I don't know. This is what I'm saying. It gets really sticky.
It does.
It gets really sticky and icky. And I think that this also, I'm sure you're going to talk about this stuff. I worry about the power behind something like a eugenics movement and the power behind these quote unquote sciences, because then we start getting into like the forced sterilization of people.
Oh, we definitely get into the forced sterilization of people.
And like that happens, and that has happened, and that continues to happen. And that is tied deeply to the eugenics movement and tied deeply to these questions that you and I are talking about right now.
Yeah, it's sticky. Like, that's why I wanted to start with like a question like that. because it's not so much that I want to like, gotcha us into being like, haha, pro-life's better. Like that's not what it's about. It's more like, first of all, to help us try to maybe understand the mindset of a lot of these eugenicists. They thought that they were very much doing the right thing. A lot of these leading eugenicists from the early 20th century believed that they were on the right side of history, and science supported them, and they were progressive, and they were, liberal and all that stuff. I think that we, especially like on this show, we've talked about eugenics several times. And certainly for me, that word just brings up, it's like a 1/3 of a slur. You know what I mean? It's like 1/3 of the word genocide. Like when I hear the word genocide, like there's this part of my body that goes, ugh. And when I hear eugenics, it's like half of that. You know what I mean? Like it's like a bad word.
Well, yeah,
almost.
because of what it symbolizes, what the word itself is a symbol for is hideous. Right.
And part of what I wanted to do with that question is try to get in the mindset of like, well, these people didn't feel that way. At one point, eugenics was a good word.
Right. I have a question for those people.
They're not here.
Well, then I have a question for you as the man speaking for these pro-eugenics people.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely me.
Were any of the people involved in these early eugenics movements of the population that these eugenicists were seeking to select out?
No.
I think that that's maybe a problem.
No.
I think that's maybe a problem. And it goes back to this, like, what is it? No representation without, what is that? No about us without us?
No taxation without representation. Yeah.
It goes back to that quote of nothing about us without us. Is that what it is?
It's that. It's also designed with, not for.
Designed with, not for. Like.
Design taxes without representation about us.
It is inherently ethically dubious for a population to be selecting out another population that is not part of the conversation. I don't want to have this conversation about like who we should and should not be aborting with people who were never in danger of that. I would rather have this conversation with people who have the lived experience.
Right. And I think just like a second thing for that question is also just to kind of like get in the mindset of like, there's multiple things going on here that could be wrong. Part of it is that it's just the science behind eugenics is bad. Part of it is there's like the content of it. Like, what if it was good and we were selecting against this versus that? And then part of it is like, or is there some larger thing at play here that feels icky to us? And it feels like the answer to that last one is yes, because even if we would be selecting for stuff we like, you answered, and I think I would also answer, there's something that still feels bad there. And
when you say the science is bad, you mean the science is unsound, ineffective.
I mean several things.
You don't mean like it's bad and it's morally bad and we shouldn't do it. You mean it's not sound science.
The science is sour.
Okay.
But let's back up a little bit. I do want to, as we do on the show, get into the history of eugenics, which means we have to start way back in the day.
I don't want to.
Eugenics was only coined at the end of the 19th century as a term, but the idea of breeding people of certain ways or controlling humans' genetic destiny before we had the words, genetic or heredity. But that kind of stuff has been around for a really long time. Plato, in his seminal work, Republic, according to Britannica, depicts a society where efforts are undertaken to improve human beings through selective breeding. And then we also just have like, the general like bloodline stuff. Like bloodlines have always been a thing. Like, oh, you can only interbreed the Habsburgs with other Habsburgs.
That shit was weird, man.
So we've always had some notion of what we would later come to call eugenics. But it wasn't until the late 19th century that we actually got the word eugenics. And we got that from aforementioned father of eugenics, Sir Francis Galton. So just to kind of set the table for this era, like what was like, why did this time period see the explosion of interest and acceptance and scientific quote unquote research into eugenics? Two big things happened towards the end of the 19th century. You have Darwin publishing On the Origin of Species.
It's all Darwin's fault.
And you also have Mendel, who I don't know if you remember your...
Yeah, the Punnett
squares.
The Punnett squares with the peas. It was peas.
Yeah. So then you have Mendelian heredity. So you have these two big like scientific advancements / frameworks for explaining things that you're able to overlay on stuff that's like very old. Like you knew that heredity and bloodlines were kind of a thing and you could breed humans and, we're breeding cows to be more domesticated. So something's going on here with breeding. But these explanatory frameworks made people kind of go like, oh, this is how it works scientifically. So we can do this with the power of science. And also think about it, like we're also in just sort of an era of advancement here in the 1800s. And as I'll get to in a second, like a lot of these eugenicists were like extremely distinguished scientists and researchers who also dabbled in eugenics.
Right.
So it gets very complicated with these guys very fast. What is eugenics, though? We kind of defined it before just so I could ask you that question. But first of all, it became an international movement and it had many varieties. It gave birth to many varieties with many different genealogies.
Can we do the Punnett squares for
for eugenics?
Eugenics?
I kind of feel like that's what Tescriel is. So the general flow is from England to the US to the rest of the world, most famously Germany. And the reason I say that is because the first two big names are British guys. Sir Francis Galton, as I mentioned, and then another guy named Karl Pearson. So Pearson was actually his protege, and the two of them were sort of like the grandfather and father of eugenics, of the eugenics movement. And then from there, it sort of moved to the US. Charles Davenport was the guy here. There was obviously a lot of scientists, a lot of political figures, a lot of people were involved in the eugenics movement. But in terms of like, if you had to point to a guy, Charles Davenport, and he was essentially like, I wouldn't call him a student of Galton and Pearson, but he studied them. He met with them he visited Great Britain and visited the universities at which they worked in the UK. So aside from its international nature, there's also something to keep in mind as we talk about this topic. You can kind of split it into positive and negative eugenics. That doesn't mean good or bad. There's like another way that people try to split it that way.
Ew.
Yeah, they try to talk about
ethical eugenics.
Yeah, liberal eugenics is what they say. So there's like the eugenics that's top down and the eugenics that's bottom up. And that's something we actually talked about with Dr. Torres a little bit. Yeah. One thing I'll say, by the way, just while we're on that tangent, liberal eugenics isn't new. My impression was that eugenics started as an idea that was purely top down, like state sterilization type programs.
Right.
And then we decided that was bad. And now we're like, but what if we could do stuff that was more bottom up? Like people get to choose what their kids' genes are or whatever. That was already the eugenics movement in the late 19th, early 20th century already featured that. There were already, one of the things at the time was like, hey, parents, be responsible and only marry someone that is of good stock. So there was already
that phrase.
I know. There was already a push to have individual citizens voluntarily do the eugenics a little bit.
Do you know what phrase I think rings of echoes of eugenics that we still use today? That I think that is just the next generation of good stock.
Beef stock.
When we talk about they're a well-matched couple. You hear that all the time, and people can hide behind because she's a marketing executive and he's a data scientist, and it's no, what you're talking about is that they look hot enough for each other, that they're the proper
hot kids.
They're the proper amount of what you think that they're in the same leagues, and they're going to have the proper kids with the proper waist to hip ratio and eye color
and white. All right. Getting back to positive versus negative eugenics, that doesn't mean the same thing as liberal versus top-down or coercive eugenics. What that means is positive is somebody who's saying let's try to get the good ones to breed more. And negative is let's stop the bad ones from breeding so much.
Okay.
So there's a differential, and some eugenicists cared more about one versus the other. I think Galton himself was more of a positive eugenicist, if I'm not mistaken, from my readings. But I'm going to read to you a definition according to Galton himself from one of the papers of his that I read. Quote, eugenics is the science which deals with all influences that improve the inborn qualities of a race, and also with those that develop them to the utmost advantage. The improvement of the inborn qualities or stock of some one human population will alone be discussed here. I guess here was actually in his paper, so maybe I didn't need to say that. In any case, that was his definition of eugenics, which, I mean, we kind of get it at this point, right? Like, I just wanted to read his definition, but like, do you feel like you get an idea of what it is?
Yes.
Because it is multifaceted, right? Like, some people are in favor of coercion. Some people are not. Some people think it's about making the good ones breed. And then some people think about it's not making the bad ones breed. And if you're a Nazi, maybe it's about just killing them just in case.
Right. I think it's good to point out that, like, there are multiple different forms, because then when we see it pop up in its less, like, negative, that's the right term, negative forms these days, like, you can still identify it. Like when Elon Musk is talking about, like, the population issue, that, like, certain people aren't having enough babies, like, that's a positive eugenics.
That's exactly what that is. Yeah.
Ideal.
Yeah. I, like, as an aside, like, I kind of hate that terminology because it, like, positive makes it sound good, like it's good, and negative makes it sound like it's bad. Like, I wish they had thought of a different term for that, but whatever. Plus
or minus.
One of the things I just want to kind of stop here and mention is that a big takeaway for me for all of this research is just how widespread and well accepted and well regarded eugenics was at the time.
Oof.
I mentioned this already, but, like, we just have this bias against that word, right? It's at this point, it's like a very negative sounding word. And there's a reason for that. Around 1945, it stopped being used as much, but
seems very late.
We'll get to that. But it wasn't always that way, right? Like, eugenics was a positive word for a long time.
Right. It wasn't a dirty word amongst the general population while it was being born.
And I know I had that bias. I think, when we talk about Urantia Tea Company and all these things, different things that have eugenics as a part of them on the show, I definitely had the bias of, like, well, it was like, a few pseudoscientific racists, the guys in Germany, bada bing, like, that's it. But it was not just that. It was very much not just that.
Right.
So continuing about Mr. Galton here, a few fun facts about him. He was actually Darwin's half cousin. So he was born for the job.
Something, we got to look at the genes of that family.
He coined the term eugenics. He also coined the, it's not a term because it's two words, but nature nurture. He coined that. And just to hit a home on how distinguished and how productive these guys were, these scientists who also liked eugenics tended to be. Here's what Galton accomplished in his life. This is just from the intro on Wikipedia to his page. He produced over 340 papers and books. He also developed the statistical concept of correlation.
Like, just correlation?
When we talk about correlation now, he basically invented that. Oh, like, these guys, a lot of these guys were, like, inventing math that we still use today that's in, like, textbooks. He also widely promoted a relatively new idea of regression toward the mean, which is, like, a very important statistical concept. He was the first to apply statistical methods to the study of human differences and inheritance of intelligence. On that note, he created the sort of like a proto IQ test. He was the first one to create a test of human intelligence, the first one to do that. He introduced the use of questionnaires and surveys for collecting data on human communities. So, like, I guess people weren't surveying humans before that. He was also a polymath, so he was, like, just good at a lot of stuff. He also founded fields called psychometrics and differential psychology. He devised a method for classifying fingerprints that proved useful in forensic science. As the initiator of scientific meteorology, he devised the first weather map. Proposed a theory of anticyclones, and was first to establish a complete record of short-term climatic phenomenon on a European scale. And then it talks here about he has another couple, like, little physical inventions that he made. He was knighted, and there's a few other minor things as well. So I know that sounds like a lot. That was like a lot of word vomit, but, like, you get the idea of this guy, and Pearson following him and several other of these guys were very similar. In fact, Pearson invented statistical mathematics. So these guys were just like, a lot of them were statisticians. A lot of them were just like scientists, but then they also were proponents of eugenics. And this
is just the Nobel disease, like, writ large.
It is. And it's really interesting. Like, these days we sort of feel like there's maybe like a conservative liberal divide amongst like racism. I think conservatives would probably disagree with that. But
I think I would disagree with that now, too.
Yeah, probably. But certainly back in these days,
right,
it was not that way. Like, racism was just a thing that everybody did.
Right,
like,
right.
It wasn't like you could be a progressive and be a racist.
Right.
And that's exactly what this guy was. Like, it specifically talks about him being a scientific racist in several places. But again, scientific racism, like, there's a difference between saying, I don't like this particular race versus I scientifically think that they're inferior.
Right.
One is a little more insidious maybe than the other. All right, so we already talked a little bit about Carl Pearson. Carl Pearson was his protege. He was also from the UK. I won't go into all the details about him, but suffice it to say, very accomplished. And then I also mentioned Charles Davenport. So he was the US guy. So he founded something in the US called the ERO, the Eugenics Records Office, located in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, which Cold Spring Harbor is just like a cool name. And he found support for that with Carnegie money. So the Carnegie Institution funded the ERO, although I will say that later on, once the ERO was closed, after eugenics was widely discredited, the Carnegie Institute pulled their funding. That's part of why they closed. But he was responsible for the adoption. I don't want to say he was solely responsible, but he was like the vanguard guy in America for eugenics. And it got pretty bad over here. So yeah. When I talk about bad, I talk about like forced sterilization. Yeah. We did that. We did a lot of that.
We did that up until like the 1970s, and we're probably still doing it.
I think the last sterilization law went off the books in like the 80s or something.
Jesus Christ.
Now they slowed down quite a bit. But do you want to guess how many, like the estimate for how many sterilizations were performed in the United States?
Like over how many years?
This was in the early, I'll say this is over like 30 years.
1 million.
Okay, good guess. No.
I was just going, I hope that that's a crazy number.
It is. 60,000 sterilizations
Good Lord.
were performed in the U.S. States started writing these laws in the 1910s. Is that what you call that decade? The 1910s? They started writing these laws, and then they got challenged because they're nuts. The most famous case was called Buck v. Bell. A young woman by the name Carrie Buck. I encourage you to look this case up because it is interesting. But bottom line is she ended up getting assigned to one of these like institutions for the feeble-minded. That was a word actually. Feeble-minded is we talked about this at the top of the episode. A lot of words that like actually meant something during this time.
Like we're like a diagnosis.
They were like a diagnosis. I don't think feeble-minded was a diagnosis, but it was a word that it was like a catch-all that eugenicists like to use to talk about people who had something wrong with their brain, or they thought. Like when you actually look at these people, it's like, no, she was just poor. Although they also they didn't want poor people to breed either. Yeah. It wasn't just like, hey, you realize this person isn't feeble-minded. They just like, that was the thing. Like they wanted to sterilize prostitutes and criminals and basically all these like quote unquote lower members of society. It all just kind of went in this one bucket. Anyway, the reason I bring up Buck v. Bell is that was the case where Carrie Buck and her lawyer challenged the constitutionality of this law. It was a Virginia law, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was like, no, it's cool. You can do that.
Good Lord.
So the Supreme Court affirmed that states could forcibly sterilize its citizens.
When was this?
So the case Buck v. Bell was decided in 1927.
Oh my God.
So again, this is all like, when you think about Francis Galton, he's like on the crossover from the 1800s to the 1900s. Pearson kind of comes a little bit after him, and then Davenport a little bit after them. And then we're into this sort of like basically eugenics was all the rage from like 1900 to the 1930s. Like it wasn't just scientists. It was all, like I said, it was also politicians, and it became very popular with just the American people in general. So once this was approved by the Supreme Court, there was other states that got into the whole sterilization game. Of the 60,000, by far the leader was California.
I feel like I knew that.
California,
and I feel like we were sterilizing people really late, too.
The absolute best at it.
Good Lord.
They forcibly sterilized approximately 20,000 of the 60,000 in America.
Shit.
And they were so good at it that the Germans came over to kind of figure out what was going on, kind of study how we were doing things over here in the Golden State.
Weren't we doing it to a lot of native populations as well, like Native American people?
I did not come across that, but I am sure.
Eesh.
I am sure, because that, again, the line from, well, we should try to breed our race to become nicer and better and smarter. The line from that to like, and by that I mean people who don't look like me.
Right.
Is like, it's just very short. It's a very short line.
Right.
So the Nazis really learned a lot from us when it comes to eugenics, unfortunately. Here's a quote I don't think you're going to like. Davenport, so you remember Charles Davenport, the main eugenics guy in the U.S., continued to maintain connections with German colleagues in the 1930s. So the 30s is when they were starting to do their shit.
Yeah.
Drawing a line
bad.
between science and politics, quote unquote, drawing a line between science and politics that allowed him to cultivate and extend his relations with Nazi racial hygienists, end quote, in the years before World War II.
Well, that's a fun thing that we don't often talk about over here, is that like a lot of Americans and a lot of America was not necessarily anti the Nazis for a very long time.
Particularly these guys.
Yeah.
The impression I have from doing this research is that there's like a smooth development of eugenics across these decades and through these countries. And Germany's policies were simply a next step. And I think that I even read that like some of them were like a little surprised that when we were like aghast at the end of the war.
Yeah.
Some of them were like, but we got this from you. In fact, specifically, there was so they performed, according to the research I did, 450,000 forced sterilizations in Germany.
Jesus Christ.
Far less than the number of people they killed. But the killing was, again, it was for eugenic reasons, right? It was just the next step.
Right.
It was just to like, well, it's so hard to sterilize these people. What if we just kill them? So they sterilized a lot of people, and that came under scrutiny at the Nuremberg trials. And one of the Nazis that was being tried there pointed to Buck v. Bell and said, your own Supreme Court says that this is okay. So why are you putting us on trial?
It feels really bad.
Yeah, it's not great. And it wasn't just Davenport, but there were other Americans other American eugenicists that were involved in Germany's eugenics program, which just, again, seemed like just another eugenics program.
Right. It wasn't
until
unique.
It went maybe a little too far for most people, not everyone, but most people.
Until it went to its logical conclusion.
Which, 2020 hindsight, right? Because at the time they all thought eugenics was good.
Right.
Oh, actually, let's apply the brakes a little bit there. Like everything, it's not 100% one way, it's not 100% the other way. There were actually a lot of contemporary critiques of eugenics.
This is why. I didn't know that. That's good to hear. I should have assumed that. And this is why I get a bee in my bonnet when we want to apply the like, well, nobody knew any better back then. Because there usually was not an insignificant amount of people who did, quote unquote, know better.
Yeah. It's sobering for me to remember that eugenicists weren't the quote unquote bad guys and they enjoyed a wide support. It's also sobering to know that the wide support wasn't universal and there were some very sharp critics. Some of the most well-known and vociferously opposed to eugenics were folks like Clarence Darrow, who's kind of like a famous lawyer. I'm going to quote him in a minute. A guy named Franz Boas. He had some apparently well-known, well-regarded debates with Mr. Davenport on the subject of eugenics. And then there was a scientist by the name Thomas Hunt Morgan. And again, I'm trying to keep this episode short, which is why I'm not really going into the details about who these guys were.
It sounds like we could do an entire season on this, and we're not doing that.
For sure. So Thomas Hunt Morgan was actually a scientist who brought some of the first major research that was hey, I didn't find anything, you guys. So here's a quote from his entry in, this is either Britannica or Wikipedia. I did not write down which. The first major challenge to conventional eugenics based on genetic inheritance was made in 1915 by Thomas Hunt Morgan. He demonstrated the event of genetic mutation occurring outside of inheritance, involving the discovery of the hatching of a fruit fly. So fruit flies are the thing that people who study inheritance use because they have very quick turnover. He demonstrated that mutation could happen outside of inheritance. So it says here he had white eyes from a family with red eyes, demonstrating that major genetic changes occurred outside of inheritance. Additionally, Morgan criticized the view that certain traits, such as intelligence and criminality, were hereditary because these traits were subjective. So those were some of the guys that were anti-eugenics. Some of their criticisms, aside from the one we just talked about, where this Thomas Morgan guy did research and was this doesn't work. But that's just a subset of one of the major critiques, which is just the scientific rigor for this was actually trash. Mm. A lot of critics at the time noted that in the process of data gathering, eugenicists gathered largely anecdotal evidence by self-administered questionnaires or other means whose uniformity or accuracy could not be verified. So basically what was happening is the ERO, the Eugenics Records Office, these guys, there was just so much fucking confirmation bias going on here.
Sure.
These guys assumed the thing that they were trying to prove, which is that these traits were heritable.
That's the bad science you were talking about.
And that's the bad science I'm talking about. And they would basically get these family genealogies and be like, yes, Uncle Franz was a criminal, just like Jacob here in the second generation. And then Jacob's brother was, did deviant behavior, which was just he said hi to a girl in 5th grade or whatever. So they would cherry pick. So they would cherry pick those, but they'd be like, those guys look bad. So of course we need to prevent these people from breeding. But then they would ignore the other 10 close relatives on that same tree that didn't have anything that they could point at. So
well, it was just so silly because it's you're pointing at one thing when there's a million explanations, and that's bad science. Right.
So we're into the section here where there's a million things wrong with it. One of the things is how arbitrary and abstract these concepts are. It's absurd to think that you can easily account for something called quote unquote intelligence.
Right.
But also, even if you could, these guys were cherry picking data.
Right.
So it wasn't there was structural problems with this. And then there's also the we're just going to cherry pick the things that make us right. So that Morgan guy, that critic we talked about earlier, also on the cons side, he made the comparison of dealing with mental defects to dealing with communicable diseases. So he said basically in the past, we could have bred people for greater resistance to cholera or tuberculosis. But it's way easier and quicker and less painful to just clean up the environment and, give people vaccines or whatever than it is to try to change the fundamental nature of human constitution.
Yeah,
Why aren't we just doing that? So there's a practical argument against it. I mentioned the guy Franz Boas before. He was a professor of anthropology at Columbia University and a strong opponent. He wrote in Scientific Monthly in 1916 that it would seem the first obligation of the eugenicist ought to be to determine what traits are truly inherited and which ones are not. Unfortunately, he wrote, this has not been the method pursued. The battle cry of the eugenicists, nature not nurture, has been raised to the rank of dogma, and the environmental conditions that make and unmake man physically and mentally have been relegated to the background. Eugenicists, Boas complained, simply assumed that most traits were inherited, which was, of course, the point to be proven in the first place.
Uh-oh. I heard a D word in there.
What's the D word?
Dogma.
Oh, dogma. Yeah, that's a criteria. Yeah. So, a criterion. Excuse me. Here's a few quotes from the lawyer that I mentioned, the semi-famous lawyer, Clarence Darrow. Apparently, by the way, he was like one of those like archetypal foghorn leghorn, like, I'm just a simple country lawyer. But his pedigree is not to get eugenicist about this, but like he
was really smart.
Apparently he had like ancestors that had served in the American Revolution. And his father was according to Wikipedia, an ardent abolitionist and proud iconoclast and religious freethinker who was known throughout his hometown as the, quote, village infidel. Well, and his mom was an early supporter of female suffrage and women's rights.
I could be called oh my God.
I know. So this guy was pretty badass. He was also like Clarence Darrow was like extremely intelligent. He was like the trope, not just of the simple country lawyer, but of like the simple country lawyer that's like way smarter and more well-read than you are. He was a leading member of the ACLU for a while. He did stuff with trade union causes. And he also was the lawyer on the side of, if you remember the Scopes monkey trial.
Oh, you better believe I do.
Yeah. So he was also the good guy lawyer in that one. So he has a whole screed on eugenics, and it's called, interestingly enough, Cult of Eugenics.
Oh, I think we have our answer, friends.
He wrote this in 1925.
Uh-oh.
No, that's not uh-oh. That's good. I
just mean uh-oh for all the guys who were like still doing eugenics.
Oh, yeah. That's not good for like the Davenports who were like working with Nazis in the 30s.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that they probably should have figured out this stuff before
they weren't not being told.
Yeah.
Quote, even if human breeding could be so controlled. Sorry, I won't do that. He didn't actually sound like that.
That was pretty good. I was kind of hoping you were going to do it.
I tried to I found a clip of him talking about something else, and it wasn't quite foghorn leghorn, but it was still pretty good. Quote, even if human breeding could be so controlled as to produce a race such as the eugenicists desire, we might still lose much that is worthwhile. It is hardly possible to breed certain qualities in without breeding others out. I, for one, am alarmed at the conceit and sureness of the advocates of this new dream. I shudder at their ruthlessness and meddling with life. I resent their egotistic and stern righteousness. I shrink from their judgment of their fellows. Everyone who passes judgment necessarily assumes that he is right. It seems to me that man can bring comfort and happiness out of life only by tolerance, kindness, and sympathy, all of which seem to find no place in the eugenicist creed. The whole program means the absolute violation of what men instinctively feel to be inherent rights. End quote.
That's the whole argument. That's the whole argument.
From 1925.
Damn, that's good.
Here's a second quote by him. In an age of meddling, presumption, and gross denial of all the individual feelings and emotions, the world is urged not only to forcibly control all conduct, but to remake man himself. Amongst the schemes for remolding society, this is the most senseless and impudent that has ever been put forward by irresponsible fanatics to plague a long-suffering human race.
Dang.
So, like, these weren't like, I don't know, maybe it's wrong.
Well, this was like, this shit's bad, you guys, and you're feeble-minded for liking it. No, he didn't say that.
No, he actually did.
Oh.
So he has another quote from this exact same, blog post, whatever the hell it was called back then. Quote, no idiot knows that he is an idiot. As a rule, and by the way, idiot was a term that was, again, like a diagnosed type term back then, probably a problematic thing to use in this context, but I am quoting him directly, and I think he knew what he was doing when he used this word. I think he was specifically trying to use eugenics terminology here against them. No idiot knows that he is an idiot. As a rule, those of small intellectual equipment are so sure of themselves that they are eager to make the race in their own image. End quote. That's
a good point. I think that just the people that are being like, I think we should do this. I don't think that they're
the dumb ones.
I don't think they're looking at themselves and going like, what are my deficiencies that I would select against? I think they're looking at other people.
And my big takeaway from Clarence Darrow is like just like the shocking arrogance of eugenicists to be like, this is correct, I know better.
Right.
So there were some famous eugenicists. I just want to list them here because it's interesting. I think a lot of people by now maybe know about John Harvey Kellogg. So that's like the Kellogg's Frosted
the Kellogg
Flakes.
guy?
Kellogg?
I mean, I knew he was a nutter, but I didn't know he was a...
He was a nutter and a eugenicist.
I knew he was like an anti-masturbation guy, an anti-sex guy.
Yeah, that was the...
I didn't know that part.
The cornflakes were so you wouldn't jerk off.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, he was also into eugenics. Helen Keller...
I have heard this. How did you confirm that?
I just looked it in several places.
Ugh, I have heard that.
Several places that I trust in my trust network. Alexander Graham Bell.
I believe it.
Yeah.
He wanted people to say ahoy when they answered the phone.
Right. Oh, yeah. We should breathe that out. Teddy Roosevelt, which he was like a very mixed bag guy, so that doesn't really surprise me at all for him.
Same.
A guy that I'll get back to either this episode or next called Adolphe Quetelet. He was a eugenicist. He was also the guy that invented BMI.
Oh, no.
It was actually called the Quetelet Index for a while until it was changed to BMI.
If you're still using the BMI as a measure of anything, maybe think about that.
And then the influential economist John Maynard Keynes. So I don't know if you've ever heard of like Keynesian economics. That's him. He's like He's kind of like the opposite of supply side, unfortunately. Like his economic theories support the idea that like of government intervention. And he's like sort of anti-laissez-faire, but he was also a eugenicist. According to his article, he was a prominent supporter of eugenics, serving as the director of the British Eugenics Society and writing that eugenics is, quote, the most important, significant, and I would add genuine branch of sociology which exists.
What is wrong with these guys?
Fat blind spots that these guys tend to have. And then, of course, there's a little bit of a elephant in the room with one Margaret Sanger, who was at the forefront of the birth control movement. She founded the organization that would later go on to be called Planned Parenthood. That was hard research to do because there's so much propaganda trying to like...
That's where I've heard of this, is not the actual history, but like the folks who are, sorry if I'm stepping on you, but folks who are anti-abortion claiming that the whole point of Planned Parenthood was Margaret Sanger eugenicsing black people. Yeah.
So, and I actually saw, it was tough to tease apart because I saw some places where it seemed like I should place someone in my trust network and like 90% of what they were saying I could confirm, but then they were actually parroting that talking point. Ooh. And so I was like, so is that true? And then I looked it up because like there is a statement. It's not. Okay. So there is a statement from Planned Parenthood basically sort of like denouncing Margaret Sanger, or at least her involvement in the eugenics movement. Okay. It still isn't like ultra clear to me. Like there are some arguments that like, oh, well, the birth control movement just like needed the oomph and funding that being pro-eugenics would give them. There's also just like birth control and eugenics, as we've talked about, is just like, does have like a bit of a natural tie. Right. Like if you want to prevent people from being born for XYZ reasons, that involves birth control. As far as the like putting clinics in predominantly black neighborhoods, that did happen. It wasn't for eugenic reasons. It was more just like the need was there, as far as I'm aware. Okay. And she partnered with black leaders at the time to put those clinics there. So that wasn't like you guys should stop having babies and you should, like she might have believed that anyway, but that's not what the clinics were. And
it's a conspiracy theory to think that these days what Planned Parenthood's ultimate nefarious goal is to do eugenics, which it's
absolutely not. And even if you want to believe the worst propaganda about Sanger, Planned Parenthood has like issued a statement that like goes into all this, like it details out here's the bad things she did and why we don't like it. But now let's jump ahead to the end of World War II. So I said 1945 was around when it got discredited. Basically what happened is once the Allies won the war and like kind of peeked under the hood in Nazi Germany, we were like, oh, that is the natural conclusion to that, isn't it? There's a lot of dead people. That's really bad. That's really bad. We shouldn't do this anymore. So it basically just like suffered like the worst brand hit in like all history. There was all kinds of organizations that had eugenics in their name that changed their names. In fact, there's a term called crypto eugenics, where basically the idea is like did eugenics go underground and rebrand, or did it get discredited? It's like a little bit of both. Like some of these organizations that were eugenic organizations probably were still mainly doing the same things and espousing the same ideals.
Changing your name doesn't mean
changing their name.
Changing your actions.
No, but the salient point there, I think, is that the popular support for eugenics just like kind of evaporated to the point where then that's when it started having that negative overtone that it has today that I'm used to, was after World War II. I will also say that, not to like go back and hate America first again, but like
I'm down.
There's definitely contention that our eugenic policies, which were, surprise, surprise, very much tied to immigration policies. So like the eugenicists succeeded in getting a lot of anti-immigration laws passed through because we didn't want that bad stock coming over here and polluting our good American stock. And a lot of that bad stock was, wouldn't you know, Jewish folks from Europe,
right,
who otherwise might have been able to refugee themselves over here and couldn't because of the immigration policies that we passed. So just another little thing there. So we already talked about some of the debunking of eugenics. Like I said, there's like a million different reasons.
And I don't know if you get into this later, but I think that just in talking about the, like, did it go underground and like the trends and where it falls, like if it's about immigrants, blah, blah, blah. I think that for a long time, the stuff that led to sterilization, forced sterilization, made its way into like our prison system.
I didn't go into that research, but that does sound exactly right.
Like, it seems like eugenics kind of goes where we, like, quote unquote, need it to go in order to uphold these, like, certain systems.
Yeah. Criminality was one of the big, like, things that they thought they could breed out of human beings. Ugh. You know, again, very precise with their terminology. Criminality. Okay. So there, like I said, there's a million reasons why eugenics is not good. To help my thoughts organized around this, I tend to use the Ian Malcolm quote, that just because we can doesn't mean that we should.
That's from Jurassic Park, you guys.
So there's the just because we can part. Can we? Is it good science? Is it possible? Not really. And then there's the, even if it was possible, should we? Right? So there's the can and there's the should. So we already talked a little bit about the can. We talked about like how much confirmation bias went into the data collection that a lot of these eugenicists were doing. I also want to hit on a couple other things. There's, they like to compare domestication of things like, crops or livestock, or like, hey, we did that. Why can't we do that with people? A very good point that I read was like, are we sure that that's good? Like, think about it from the cow's perspective. Are they actually better off? I don't think so.
The cows are not better off. The chickens are not better off.
None of those animals.
And even in some ways, there are instances in which the ways we've done like the selective breeding in agriculture that has also
monoculture has
been bad to us.
Bad to us, yeah. But like, if you think about it from the perspective of those animals, none of those things are good for those. It's good for us.
Right.
Like, we get more cows and they're bigger or whatever, but like...
Right, domesticated cows are not superior to wild cows.
If you gave them the option to do that to themselves, I don't think that they would.
We didn't uplift the cows.
So it's not a really good analogy to say like, we made cows better so we can make ourselves better. No, not if we're doing that.
We could make ourselves tastier.
Yeah, we could probably make ourselves tastier. I also, this is a quote, I think this is from that Morgan guy that did the fruit fly research, but he basically said like, would you say that you could enact a successful breeding program for ants based on your knowledge of oyster biology? You probably wouldn't say that.
That's true.
Then why do you think that we can do a human breeding program based on pea pods?
And fucking fruit flies. And
as an aside here, the pea pods thing, Mendel's experiments are like shockingly simplified. And I think it's generally considered a good thing. Like, we might not have ever discovered the types of like inheritance patterns that he discovered if he hadn't purposely, like, he basically went to get the most like basic peas that he could find that had like well-known properties of like passing on traits to the next generation. Like, he purposely sought out a plant that could like kind of control for a lot of complexifying factors that occur in many other species. So like, even using that as a way to extract, there's like 10 different reasons why using it to extrapolate is a bad idea. And then in terms of the bad science, genetic inheritance is extremely complex, much more complex than the eugenicists at the time gave it credit for, much more than they even knew about. There's a complex interplay between genes, environment, epigenetics, and more when you're talking about the development of an organism. There have been huge, significant discoveries in the science of genetics since the early 1900s. For example, epigenetics. They didn't know about that. In the 1960s, non-coding DNA was discovered. And at first it was thought to be junk DNA. Now we know that it does like all kinds of different like regulatory stuff inside the nucleus. And it's like 99% of the DNA in a gene is non-coding DNA.
Oh my God.
Just to be clear, non-coding means it does not contain instructions to build a protein. It's there for some other reason. So there was just like a lot going on here that they didn't even know about, like the unknown unknowns. But again, they're like way too arrogant and way too confirmation bias.
Right.
It's not even confirmation bias. It's like motivated reasoning, right? It's
right.
like, I really want this to be true. That intelligence is simple and is simply inherited because I just want it to be.
I think that's why I don't want to invoke, when you ask me, like, should we do eugenics if we could do it good? I don't want to invoke the, like, well, I don't think people should be playing God thing, but also, like, this is kind of the reason why we should be the most careful when it comes to playing, quote unquote, playing God in this way, because we are not God. And we probably will never be as omniscient as a mythological God.
Speak for yourself, Kayla.
We need to
I'm doing nootropics.
Have a little bit of humility in thinking that, like, we're never at the end of science.
Yeah,
and so
the humility is drastically lacking in this whole venture. So those are like sort of my summary of why the science isn't good. Like, just because we can't do it. Doesn't mean we should. We also shouldn't. So the shouldn't reasons, there's a bunch of those too. We already talked about it as like a terrible use of resources. Like, wouldn't it be smarter to just, whatever the thing is, shouldn't we just do a social program? Like, wouldn't that be much easier than like changing the entire race?
Rather than like breeding out the poor, shouldn't we just not structure our societies
way easier,
resulting in a lot of poor people?
And as a lazy person, that reason appeals to me quite a bit. We just talked about the sort of like height of arrogance problem. There is a researcher named Andrzej Pekalski from the University of Warsaw argues that eugenics can cause harmful loss of genetic diversity. You're kind of talking about this actually
with the bananas.
With the bananas and the monoculture. Yeah. It can cause harmful loss of genetic diversity if a eugenics program selects a sciencey type gene that could possibly be associated with a positive trait. So actually, he's not even talking about diversity for diversity's sake, which is important. He's actually saying he uses the example of, what if there's a coercive government eugenics program that prohibits people with myopia from breeding? That might have the unintended consequence of also selecting against high intelligence, since the two tend to go together.
Wait, really?
Well, this is a very tenuous example, but like, if you imagine that people with glasses are smarter,
and I do because I'm wearing glasses.
Because you're wearing glasses, then in this scenario, if trait A is undesirable, but it's correlated with trait B, and you don't let people with trait A mate, then you're going to lose out on trait B. Oops.
But what about, Chris, the fact that boys don't make passes at girls who wear glasses?
So they don't breed anyway. Okay. I guess that just works then.
That's not true.
And then, of course, there's like, I don't know, this is probably the biggest, or at least it's number one or two in terms of shitty things about eugenics is, what do we mean by better?
That's a good question. Sorry, I'm going to not yell that. Let me do that differently.
I think you should. I'm going to leave it.
That's a good question.
And like, if we could even miraculously define intelligence, like let's say there's a world where intelligence is a word with precision.
Not the most imprecise word known to man.
Is more intelligent even better?
No.
Would it be better if everyone was of the same level of intelligence?
No.
Like, that's not obvious. That's not an obvious conclusion.
It's not a better world if we're all of Mike Judge's intelligence, because then all the movies would be Idiocracy.
I'm going to jump back to Galton here. Because he has a little quote here that is not good. He was the main eugenics guy, right? So in one of his papers, he writes, a considerable list of qualities can easily be compiled that nearly everyone except cranks would take into account when picking out the best specimens of his class. So Kayla, only cranks would disagree with this.
Only cranks.
It would include health, energy, ability, manliness, and courteous disposition.
Oh, the famous genes for manliness and courteous disposition. How in God's name are you, with a straight face, telling me that you're taking a nature approach to courteous disposition? This
makes me go like, okay, I see why Clarence Darrow was like just shredding these guys sometimes.
Yeah.
Oh man, and then it makes me go like, how it's you know what, it's the Nobel disease, because like how I was gonna say, how were they so good at statistics and they're also so dumb? But like, there you go, you can't just say intelligence, because you might be good at statistics and you might also be a scientific racist.
Well, and these people, I think that like when you are very skilled in one arena, we have this fallacy that like that means you're just skilled in arenas, particularly like science arenas, when like we could do an entire season of this show. We could probably do multiple seasons of this show of scientists who were brilliant in one field.
That would just be a different podcast.
Absolute
numbskulls.
I'm trying to think of a word that's not eugenicist. Absolute diagnosed morons. No. Absolute dumbasses when it came to the other things that they were doing. And this seems to be a really clear case.
I agree. And it's weirdly ironic that it's true about the guy who invented it.
Did he go to Harvard? Sorry.
No.
Don't put that in there.
It might have been Oxford because he was British.
Ew.
Which Oxford's every bit as bad. Here's another quote by a journalist named Edwin Black. He penned a book called War Against the Weak, which like, I wanted to read it. I didn't have time, but it's like apparently just like really gets deep into the American eugenics movement. And there's not good stuff that it talks about. I mean, it's good that he's talking about it. Anyway, he argues that eugenics is often deemed a pseudoscience because what is defined as a genetic improvement of a desired trait is a cultural choice rather than a matter that can be determined through objective scientific inquiry.
That is a very good point.
And he continues, indeed, the most disputed aspect of eugenics has been the definition of improvement of the human gene pool, such as what is a beneficial characteristic and what is a defect. Historically, this aspect of eugenics is often considered to be tainted with scientific racism and pseudoscience, for obvious reasons. So again, what is better? What do we mean by better? By what standard? Now, I think on like a micro level, maybe you could I think there's just maybe sometimes the extrapolation out to a macro level doesn't work, or extrapolation from a micro level to like other aspects of our, like you said, well, you know, if we can prevent Tay-Sachs disease, why can't we make people smarter?
Right.
I use Tay-Sachs as an example because that is something that like people are currently like making decisions about like whether to have children if they have genes for Tay-Sachs disease. We have already talked about genetic testing in children, which is like, it's literally a eugenics thing. Right? We're making decisions about breeding based on this like data about how they're going to turn out.
Right.
I would say it's liberal eugenics because it's individual choice. It's not the state coming down and being like, you can't have that baby. It's going to be Tay-Sachs. It's individual, but it's definitely eugenics. And, you know, I can see some, as dumbasses as these guys are, I can also see them saying like, if we can breed Tay-Sachs out, that's good, right? Well, why can't we make smarter people? Isn't that also good?
And that's where I think they're wrong.
I think it's a huge leap.
Right.
But that's the leap that they're making.
It's as close to saying like, I think that we can breed fruit flies so we can breed humans. Like it's just such a wild jump to a conclusion that it's really hard to take seriously when we're talking about it, you know, from this 2020 hindsight perspective.
Yeah. And then the last thing, and I think this is probably number one in terms of like why it's shitty, is the like, we mentioned this already in the show, the path from select for desirable traits to suppress people different than me from breeding is very short. So much of this, of what we've been talking about, is just people being afraid of great replacement theory. Like, when I was researching all of this, like, you read statements of the form, I'm scared that the bad people will outbreed the good people. You read that so much.
That's what the premise of Idiocracy is.
And that's why we start with Idiocracy. And that's why Idiocracy is so bad, is because this is like foundational to eugenics. It's really not just like, they say it's let's improve the species, but the amount of times I read, I'm worried about the bad people outbreeding the good people, like I would be $1 million if I had a nickel for each time I read that. So it's just one of the core pillars of eugenics. And and that means right off the bat, like, I don't fucking buy it, right? Like, this is just a scientific way to justify, like, we should only breed good people. What are good people? Well, like, wealthy, white, don't have syphilis, and don't misbehave when they're, women. When women misbehave, then we should sterilize them, of course. It's that. Right. It's just what is, like, when I say by what standard, we're like, you can't standardize this. They kind of do have an answer for that.
Right.
They're like, well, rich white people, obviously.
And this is why when we talked about it, we kind of came to the conclusion that there's a deep naivete in the, like, transhumanist extropian idea of, like, well, yeah, it's okay if we give people the choice to do what they want. Like, right. Cool, but let's look at history. Like I said about William McCaskill in the last episode, it's like, cool, I love your idealism. Let's look at history. Let's plan for that and not go, it won't be a problem.
Right. Unless you're thinking this is like sort of like an implied thing with these guys, it's not. Like, they were like, no, some races are dumber than others.
Right.
Like, right out. This is what I mean by, like, racism used to kind of just be like totally out in the open and fine. Like, it wasn't relegated to like a culture war. It was like, yeah, well, these races are dumb and these ones are good. And then we like look at Nazi Germany and we're like, man, you guys shouldn't have said that over there.
Right.
We didn't. Did we? No, we did. We were saying that.
We didn't justify, like, slavery and genocide with those exact ideas.
Right. So I'll just say, just to wrap up on that point, like, it seems like people have evolved to be deeply afraid of things like being outbred by competing organisms, right? Like, it just seems like we have this deep-seated fear, because it's still around today. Like, people are still terrified of that today.
Right.
People talk about that all the time. People talked about that when I was growing up. People are talking about it now. What if they come in and these bad people outbreed everyone?
Right, right.
And it's everywhere. It's in America. It's in France. They talk about that in France.
In France?
Yeah, with Muslim immigrants. But Kayla, what does this all have to do with transhumanism?
I don't know.
And the rest of the Escrael. Next time on Cult or Just Weird, we tie that knot together. But if you want the short version, consider this is the slogan from the 1921 International Eugenics Congress. Quote, "Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution," end quote. Now, if that's not a transhumanist statement, I don't know what is. This is Chris.
This is Kayla.
And this has been
a really hard episode.
Cult or Just Weird.